on the other end of this somewhere, and she will also be participating today as we work through your questions. And so don't hesitate, as I said, to post questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer them all at the end of the session. With that, I'm going to let Jeremy share his screen, and we'll get started.
We're getting there. Is that coming through?
Mm-hmm. You look good.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeremy Scherf. I'm a forester with the Department of Natural Resources Division of Forestry. I've been in the service forestry program for almost 20 years. We work with private woodland owners, give them advice on managing their woods, tree plantings, timber harvesting, invasive species control, all those kind of fun things. And the great part about the job is spending our days out in the woods with landowners. So here a little more recently, I've taken on a role as a supervisor, and I've also taken over as the coordinator for the Ohio Forest Tax Law program. So I've worked with Forest Tax Law for 20 years and with CAUV as well. But when you start running the program, you get to learn a little more of the details about it. So taxes, I think, are everybody's least favorite topic. But at least if we're going to talk about taxes, we can talk about some ways to help save you some money and save what you're having to pay on your taxes. So we're going to do a little bit of history of the two programs. We're going to do some comparisons of the two programs. We're going to talk about each of them individually and then try to give you some tips on which program might be better for you, or at least how you can figure that out. And also probably should note that we're going to go a lot more in depth into forest tax law than CAUV. We'll explain a little bit why later, but mainly because forest tax law is a program administered by the Division of Forestry versus CAUV that's administered by the county auditors. So, all right here. So as many of you probably know, Ohio was historically covered in forests. 200 years ago, at the time of European settlement, Ohio was estimated to be as high as 95% forested. And these included lands that the Native Americans had cleared. And after they were done farming them, or whatever use they had for them being cleared, they naturally reverted to forest, as forests love to do. But by the first decade of the 1900s, Ohio's forest cover had dropped to 10%. The clearing for agriculture, for iron ore, for charcoal production, basically cleared everything, and then they started farming those grounds. And there was a growing concern for the timber supply in Ohio. You can see this photo here is actually some formerly forested lands that were farmed and then stopped farmed. And if you can see closely into that picture, there's some foresters out there planting trees. Ohio's forests were in trouble, and property tax incentives were seen as a way to encourage forest management and to regenerate our forests. So we have two programs here in Ohio: the Current Agricultural Use Valuation, otherwise known as CAUV, and the Ohio Forest Tax Law, sometimes known as OFTL. CAUV is administered by each county auditor. We have 88 counties in Ohio. Forest tax law is administered by the Ohio Division of Forestry through its service forestry program. CAUV reassesses the tax value of the property based on the land use and the productivity of the soil. Because of this, because land uses vary and soil productivity varies, and many properties will have many different soil types on them, the tax reduction is going to vary significantly from landowner to landowner. So it's hard to calculate that. Forest tax law is going to provide a 50% tax reduction on your wooded acres. Forest tax law was first enacted in 1925, where CAUV didn't come into play until 1974. So some more comparison here. Both programs require a minimum of 10 acres. For CAUV, it's 10 acres in agricultural production. Remember, timber is an agricultural crop. And for forest tax law, a minimum of 10 acres in forest land. You can qualify with less than 10 acres under CAUV, but you must be producing $2,500 in income per year for the last 3 years in order for that to qualify. So you're typically looking at vegetable production, tomatoes, things like that, where you're going to be able to make that kind of income off of a small acreage. So both programs have a one-time application fee. CAUV is $25. Forest tax law is $75. Under CAUV, you fill out an annual renewal form with the auditor and mail that into them stating what you're doing. With forest tax law, we now have a self-certification renewal every 5 years where we will send you a form. You'll fill it out stating what you've done over the last 5 years, what you intend to do over the next 5, and then mail that back to us. If we feel like under forest tax law that either you want to visit, you can request one, or if we feel like there's a need for us to come out, we can come out and do an on-site inspection. So under either program, we can do an inspection at any time. For CAUV, it's going to be the county auditor or one of their staff members that checks for compliance. And under forest tax law, it's going to be our service forester. So for CAUV and forest tax law, they do have different application periods. For CAUV, you can only apply between the first of the year and the first Monday in March. You show up a day later and they're not going to take your application. Under forest tax law, you can apply year round. But if you get all the paperwork in and we get it processed by October 1st, you will gain the tax break for the entire calendar year. So one thing to remember, and a lot of people don't understand this, is that you do pay your taxes in arrears. And what this means is that your current tax bill is for last year's taxes. So any change in your tax bill actually happened last year. So when applying for either program, depending on the time of year you apply for it, you may not see that tax savings for a full tax year. So sometimes there's a pretty good gap in there between you're getting the paperwork done and actually seeing that tax reduction in your tax bill. So as far as leaving the program, any penalties, CAUV does have a recoupment fee of 3 years of the tax savings. And what that means is that you're going to have to pay back your tax savings over the previous 3 years if you leave the program, whether you leave it voluntarily or they remove you from it. Under forest tax law, there is no penalty. You simply go back to paying your normal tax rate. So let's talk a little bit about CAUV. CAUV authority was enacted in 1974 through the Ohio Revised Code sections 5713.30 through 5713.38. It's probably the most boring thing I say all day, hopefully. But it is important to note that the CAUV law is rather vague, particularly when it comes to forest land. So there's a lot of room for interpretation of it. We have 88 different counties in Ohio. And I joke around sometimes and sometimes say there's 130 different interpretations of the law because that's the way it seems sometimes. But in reality, every county auditor kind of interprets the law differently and sets their requirements differently in that regard. So it's really hard for me to tell you what you need to do to be in CAUV and what your requirements are going to be. But some of the basic things that we're seeing, some counties simply require a paid application and 10 acres or more in agricultural production. So as long as you have 10 acres in corn, cattle is a combination of hay and cattle. So corn, hay, cattle, timber, remember timber's an agricultural crop, or any of the other types of agriculture we do out in Ohio, or here in Ohio. Other counties may require a written forest management plan. And in some cases, they make you follow that plan for 3 years prior to being eligible. There is a wording in the law that states that you have to manage that property for 3 years. So it could be you have to cut hay for 3 years, or graze cattle for 3 years, or follow a written forest management plan for 3 years. So, and those forest management plans will vary as far as the requirements. In some counties, they're very loose on what a plan can be. In other counties, they're very strict on what a plan has to be. A few counties will ask that you be in forest tax law for 3 years before you're eligible for CAUV. And I'm not sure that this is the case anymore, but for a while, there was a few counties in Ohio that wouldn't even allow woodland in CAUV. You had to go forest tax law if you wanted a tax break. So there's really a lot of differences out there. So non-commercial forest land usually qualifies along with traditional agricultural ground if the agriculture is 10 acres or minimum. So if you owned a 30-acre property and you had a 10-acre hay field and you were cutting and selling the hay, they would allow your forest land to qualify along with that 10-acre hay field without any additional work by you. But if your forest land is not associated with that ground, it would have to qualify on its own per that county's auditor's requirements. So if they require you have a plan, you would have to have a forest management plan. So the county auditor's requirements for content and author of the plan vary by county. I kind of alluded to this, but you know, they are very different. So instead of just going out and getting a plan and getting one written and trying to turn it in, you may want to check with that auditor and find out what the plan requirements are and if they have a preference over what type of forester or who can write the plan, because they do vary significantly. So for CAUV, if you need a plan, it would need to be written by a private consulting forester. But again, check with your county auditor for their requirements. They may have their own list. A lot of the auditors will use the list pictured here on this slide. This is a list through the Ohio Society of American Foresters. It's their consulting forester directory. It is available online at that website that's posted there, www.osafdirectory.com. In order to be on this list, you do have to be a forester. You have to have a degree in forestry and abide by some ethical standards, and then pay a fee to be on the list. But so at least you know you are hiring somebody that has a degree in forestry. So we're going to move on to forest tax law. So here's some language from 1912 that allowed forest tax law and reducing taxes on forestry and agriculture. Had to do with conservation of natural resources, and paraphrasing it said, laws may be passed to encourage forestry and agriculture. Areas devoted exclusively to forestry may be exempted in whole or in part from taxation. So that's the basis of what allowed us to do some of this. In 1925, Ohio's first forest tax law was passed, and it implemented the Ohio constitutional authority to lower the forest tax rate. So forest land which the owner devotes exclusively to forestry or timber growing shall be taxed annually at 50% of the local tax rate upon its value. That comes out of Ohio Revised Code, section 5713.23. And this is administered by the chief of the Division of Forestry, and he hands out authority down to the service forestry that covers those counties. So the idea in 1925 was to encourage private landowners to grow timber and grow better quality forests. And this effort still continues today to help folks keep functional forests. And it provides essential forest products and other forest benefits versus the fragmentation and loss of these benefits. We're all seeing and feeling forest fragmentation, and it is working. It's kind of working. This slide is supposed to, it made it one stage, it's supposed to show a full forest, and then step by step, the houses get built to show the forest fragmentation. That's really cool. Sorry you don't get to see it. But fragmentation is becoming a huge issue everywhere we go. Farms get sold at 100 acres or 200 acres, and they get divided up into 5-acre lots or 10-acre lots. And it becomes very hard to manage those forests. It becomes hard to do timber sales and things like that. So it's one of the goals of this program is to help reduce the impact of that. In the late 1930s, the law was amended and brief formal agreement was established. So landowners in the forest tax law actually signed an agreement form. And it basically said that they will protect their ground or their forest from livestock, and they'll keep livestock out of the woods to the best of their ability to protect it from wildfires. When timber is being cut, protect and favor the young trees, and the forest will be maintained in a productive condition. So kind of vague, kind of general, but some basic guidelines that a landowner should follow in order to receive that tax break. So remember, in the early 1900s, Ohio was about 10% forested, and from the 1940s to the 1990s, the forest cover in Ohio rebounded drastically, up to an estimated 30%. And I've always enjoyed watching this photo because, if you live in a certain portion of Ohio, you're used to seeing what you're seeing around you, and sometimes you don't realize how non-forested some areas are or how heavily forested other areas are. So the green in this photo is forest. The light blue color is urban areas, and the tan is non-forest ground, and the dark blue is water. So that was through 1994. As of the 2016 survey, Ohio woodland still was at about 30% coverage. So it's really kind of leveled off there. Currently in the forest tax law program, we have 130,000 acres and 3,500 woodland owners. The average OFTL woodland size is 36 acres. So we talk about forest land and what is the definition of forest land. So for forest tax law, forest land means land for which the primary purpose is the growing, managing, and harvesting of a commercial forest product of commercial species. A merchantable forest product of commercial species. So what's a merchantable forest product? So we're looking at timber, which could be saw logs or veneer, pulpwood, which is either lower grade logs or smaller logs that are typically turned into paper pulp, poles, posts, chips, firewood, fuel wood, maple syrup is a forest product. But this definition does exclude Christmas trees and orchards. So your Christmas tree plantation or your apple orchard is not going to qualify as a merchantable forest product, and thus not qualify for the tax reduction under forest tax law. Christmas trees, I know for sure, and apple orchards could qualify for CAUV though, because they are agricultural crops. So, let's see here. For forest tax law, forest lands management means the landowner has an active physical role in enhancing the stand quality, the future productivity, and the environmental quality of their forest land. It just basically means they want to be hands-on in improving the quality of their woodlands. So minimum qualifications for forest tax law. As we talked about, you have to have a minimum of 10 acres of forest land. If you have multiple parcels, that's okay, but they must be under the same ownership name. So even if, a landowner, husband and wife own the property, and one parcel is under the husband and wife's name, the other parcel is just under the husband's, we can't combine those two in the same law because they're different owners. Forest land must be at least 120 feet wide, which you don't think about a whole lot, but you can certainly get some areas that are smaller than that. And gaps of less than 1 acre or less than 120 feet wide can still be considered forest land. So if you've got a 75-foot pipeline running through your woods, we would just pretend that's not there and call it all forest land. You got a 3/4 acre pond or a 3/4 acre food plot, again, it's under 1 acre, so we would consider it as forest land. But if that gap gets larger than 120 feet or larger than 1 acre in size, then we would have to exclude that area. That's really just about compatible uses, things that are congruent with the forest and are compatible with the forest. One of the big requirements is property boundaries must be marked every 100 feet. That law used to be 66 feet. We changed it a few years ago to 100 feet. But basically the points still need to be visible from each point. So you need to be able to stand at one mark and see the next. We do have some pretty specific guidelines on how those boundaries need to be marked. But flagging tape on the tree is not going to work. Typically, we're talking a permanent paint mark on the tree. I always recommend to use brushed on paint with a paintbrush rather than aerosol. However, there is a boundary paint that's aerosol on the market now that works pretty well. But definitely the fluorescent paints don't stand up very long. You need to maintain these boundary marks through the time that you're in the program. So you're gonna have to repaint them occasionally. You want to do something that's gonna last. It doesn't have to be paint. It could be an existing fence. It could be posts that are at least, I think, 4.5 feet high. It could be signs, but the signs have to be quality, heavy duty permanent signs. The plastic ones that come in a roll that deteriorate quickly won't work. And also, if your woodland meets field and the actual property line is the edge of the field, then that would need to be marked as well, or would not need to be marked. So to qualify as forest land, it must include at least 300 stems per acre for younger plantations, or 50 square feet of basal area of forest, which is a measuring tool that foresters use to determine the amount of trees and amount of ground covered by trees in a forest. But basically, there are minimum standards of what qualifies as forest land. And if you're looking at reforesting a field to trees, we want to see a 1-year survival of at least 300 stems per acre. Which typically when we're doing an open field plantation, we're doing 8 to 10 foot spacing, which will be anywhere from 400 plus trees per acre to almost 700 trees per acre. So that's still a pretty good ratio. And the forest land must be accessible for management. We look at this in a couple different ways. You have to be able to access the property. Sometimes if the ground's landlocked and you can't get into it to manage it, or you don't have a right of way, or if you can't get equipment in, like a skidder to get the timber out, then it's not going to be something that can be managed, and we may not qualify for a program. But also, we're running into issues with deed restrictions and that some communities are putting on, or if you sign a conservation easement that doesn't allow you to manage your timber. Both of those can put restrictions on your property to where you can't cut a tree down, or you can't do certain things that are going to be required. So either way, the forest land has to be able to be managed or be accessible for management. So we talk about the application process a little bit. This is our application is one page. You can see on your screen here. The landowner should provide to the service forester the filled out application, a copy of their tax bill, a map of the property with the boundaries marked, and a copy of the forest management plan. And the copy of the forest management plan is important. It is up to the landowner to get their own forest management plan. In years past, the service forester would write it. We don't always have the time to do that anymore. So we're referring a lot of those over to private consulting foresters. And I'll talk about some options here in a little bit to get a plan. But I usually tell my landlords, if you don't have a plan, to hold on to your application until you get one, and then turn it in to me all at one time. So once the service forester receives your application, he's going to review your management plan to make sure it meets the minimum standards of our program. We'll usually meet with the landowner, or at least talk with them over the phone about the rules of the program and the requirements and what they're going to be agreeing to do. And then the forester is going to walk the property with or without the landowner, depending on the situation, to verify the accuracy of the plan and to verify that the property boundaries are marked. We ask the property boundaries be marked before we even come onto the property. And boundary marking is important for a few different reasons. One of which is so you know where your property is and where you're working. It's also so your neighbor knows the same thing. But if you're cutting timber, it keeps the logger on your property. If your neighbor's cutting timber, it keeps the logger on their property. The next step, once the forester reviews the property and the plan and everything's good, he will send the landowner our agreement form. Landowner is supposed to read that over and make sure they understand what they're agreeing to. There's going to be 3 forms. They'll have to sign all 3 forms and return all 3 forms to us. And then there's an application fee of $75 at that time. And then once we receive all that, we process the paperwork and send it on to the county auditor to get the tax reduction applied. So we can talk about woodland management plans, forest management plans, woodland stewardship management plans. They have a lot of different names. But one of the things to point out is in the High Revised Code for Forest Tax Law, it does say all forest land qualifying under the provisions of the Forest Tax Law rule shall be managed according to a forest management plan approved by the chief. In this case, it would be approved by the surface forester. So it is a requirement that they have a management plan and that they follow it. So just a couple things to point out. I'm not going to go into every detail of what makes up a forest management plan, but typically, if you've never seen one, it's going to have a map of the property, and it's going to break the woods up into different stands. And a stand is a unique way to describe an area of forest. So you might have an oak hickory stand and a white pine stand, very distinct, different species. You might have a large saw timber stand, which would be really large trees, and a small saw timber stand, which is, much smaller trees that are just becoming marketable. So there's a lot of different ways. It could be done by terrain. It could be done by species. It could also be done by need. You might have an area that's ready to harvest and everything is great. You might have another area that needs a lot of work to control grapevine and invasive species. So, but that map is going to show you how that forester is dividing that up, and then he's going to give you specific recommendations for each area. The maps typically are going to show the location of the property, the county, the township, the landowner's name, the acreage of woods, and the total acres. And that's important for forest tax law. We need to know how many acres of qualifying forest land are on a property versus total, and then where those woods are on a property. If there's basically we need to know what's not forest land and what's not being considered. The acreage for each of those stands is good to have, a north arrow, so we can orient ourselves. One thing this map does not have that we do require is that the parcel boundaries and the parcel number be labeled on it. This could be one parcel, I don't know from this map, but we would need a parcel number and a parcel boundaries on it. Another important part of the management plan is the activity schedule. And this basically tells you what you need to do in what stand of the property, and it gives you kind of a schedule or a time frame of when it should be done. Sometimes when we're writing a management plan, we'll just say do this in this 10-year time period. Just it needs to be done, but there's no rhyme or reason as to when. But other times, let's say we're going to do a harvest in 5 years, and the grapevine need to be controlled before that harvest, and we really like to see 3 years between the grapevine being controlled and the timber being harvested. So we might put your timber harvest for 5 years from now and the grapevine control in the next 2 years. So you get your grapevine control done in the first 2 years of the plan. You got 3 years for things to kind of recover and the vines to complete dying off, and then move into the timber harvest. So having a kind of a schedule or at least a priority section is important to know what you should be working on and what portion of the plan. So how do you get a woodland management plan for OFTL, and what are the requirements? Forest tax law does have a requirement as to who can write the plan. We do have a list of foresters that are qualified to write it. That list is, we call our Ohio Forest Tax Law Professional Forester list. It is pictured here. It's multiple pages, though. It's just the first page of it. But the people on the list currently have attended a class on forest tax law and what we require, and then they also have a minimum education. We're going to be doing some modifications to that moving forward, so we can expand that list out, but that's the basic requirements right now. But they don't have to be on this list if they are a certified forester through the Society of American Foresters, or they are a member of the Association of Consulting Foresters. So those are the three categories that somebody could fall into to write a plan for forest tax law. And they could be in all three of them, but one of them is enough. Another option a landowner has if they don't want to pay a private forester to write a plan for them is that there is a cost share program through the Natural Resources Conservation Service called EQIP, EQIP. It's short for the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. You can get a CAP plan, which is a conservation activity plan. You'll find in this world we have a lot of acronyms. But basically, this program would pay for the landowner's cost of getting a management plan. You have to be pre-approved. So you have to apply, you have to get approved, and then they'll give you a list of foresters that can write the plan. And then you go get the plan, and then once you have that plan, you turn it in, you can apply for forest tax law. But it doesn't cost you anything. So it is a really great option. The only real downside to it is the time frame. The program has continuous sign up, but they only collect the applications once a year, and they're currently doing that now for last year's application. So it does take some time. You might be waiting a year to get that plan under this program. So, but it is certainly a good option. So once you're in the program, we can talk a little bit about the things you would need to do to maintain your certification. So we mentioned the management plan. You know, we are expecting you to follow that management plan. There are going to be things that are in that plan, such as timber stand improvement, we call it TSI, things like grapevine control, controlling invasive species, maybe cutting out junk trees, doing a tree planting. It just depends on what your forest needs. And we're going to look for that to be completed according to the time frame that is suggested in your management plan. Now, we have made a shift in recent years that we're really looking for progress. We're not looking that your plan says do 100 acres of grapevine control and you've only done 90, we're kicking you out of the program. No, we're not doing that. What we want to see is that you are working towards that goal of getting that work done. You know, if you're supposed to do 100 acres in 10 years, which is a lot, don't get me wrong, I just throwing numbers out here, and you've got 1 acre done, we're going to need to see some more progress in that. But you got, you know, some progress made and you're working towards it, and you're showing us that you're getting some of that work done. You know, we're probably going to be pretty happy with it. So, and there are vendors out there that can do this work for you if you don't have the time, you're not capable. And that EQIP program that will pay for you to get a forest management plan also has a program that could, if you would qualify for it, would reimburse you for getting some of this work done. Again, you have to apply ahead of time, get pre-approved, and then go do the work, and then you get paid for it. But we have people you could hire to do that work. And if you don't want to go through that program, we have people you can hire out of your pocket to do some of this work. So, timber harvesting is a big part of our program. I want to say it's not required. It's required that you're working towards a timber harvest. And in many of my landowners, that harvest might be 30 or 40 years away because their woods is younger. But it just depends on your goals and what your plan says and what your woods needs. But when you are harvesting timber, it must be an acceptable silvicultural method. A diameter limit cut is typically not an acceptable method where you cut everything over a certain diameter. We're looking for a forester prescribed silvicultural type of harvest, whether it be a single tree selection or a group selection or some of the other methods out there. But this plan also has to be in accordance with your management plan. The harvest has to be prescribed in your management plan. So you can't just go do a timber harvest and say, hey, I cut timber, I qualify. It's supposed to be required or recommended in that plan. Now, your plans are fluid. Goals change, situations change, timber markets change, invasive species show up like emerald ash borer. You might not have had a timber harvest scheduled in your plan. Emerald ash borer shows up, starts killing all your ash trees, and you need to do a salvage harvest to salvage them. That's fine, and that is okay, but you need to modify your plan technically before you do that harvest. So work with your service forester or work with the forester that wrote your plan. And we can do a modification to that plan and make sure that it's something that's allowed to happen. One of the requirements when cutting timber is that an Ohio certified master logger must be used to perform the timber harvest. We want to see you use a forester to oversee that harvest, but the master logger is required. There is a waiver that this can be used to waive this, but we don't do it very often, and it's really only in situations where no master loggers are willing to buy the timber. But you would need to work with your service forester on that. So maintaining your certification, like I said earlier, we do a self-certification every 5 years. In the years past, what that meant was we would actually come out and meet with the landowner, verify that they're following their management plan, and give you some advice and so forth on your property. We're currently doing a self-certification where we send you the inspection form, you fill it out, tell us what you've been working on, and send it back to us. If we see a red flag, we may come out and do an inspection. If you've done a timber harvest, we will do an inspection to make sure it was done right. But also if you feel like you want to visit, you need a visit, you have questions, then we'll come out and meet with you. But in many cases, we work with you throughout the year or every other year or something on other things you're working on. So the service force already kind of knows what's going on the property, and a visit may not be necessary. And we're getting a lot of people in the program, and it's hard for us to keep up with some of the inspections. So this is a way to help get those done. So we'll send you a letter and the inspection form, you fill that out, send it back to us, and everything moves forward. And again, we're looking for you to make progress on your forest management plan, and also to keep your property boundaries visibly marked. So a landowner can withdraw from the program at any time, and you can voluntarily withdraw from it without penalty. And when that happens, and for whatever reason you want out of the program, you don't want to follow your plan anymore or whatever, there's no penalty, and your property would be going back to being taxed again at its full rate. Under CAUV, there is that 3-year recoupment fee. So keep that in mind, that you would have to pay back to the county auditor. So why might we decertify you from the forest tax law program? If you don't maintain your property boundaries, the markings, that's a very strict requirement in the program that has to be followed. Not following your forest management plan, which could be doing a non-silvicultural timber harvest, or doing a harvest that's not prescribed in the plan, not doing invasive species control, things like that could cause us to decertify you. Changes in your legal owner. If you sell the property to somebody else, that's going to kick it out. Or if it transfers through the family, it could kick it out. But the key here is there are ways to keep it in the program in most situations. You just need to work with us ahead of time. If you're thinking about making a deed change, contact your service forester. If it's changing from one family member to another, we may be able to just transfer that management plan over, keep the certification going. If it's being sold, there are ways to transfer that management plan over and keep that certification going, but we have to know it ahead of time. The worst that happens is it gets decertified and you reapply, and there's no penalty in doing that. But another thing that could happen is a change in use status. It's all woods and you suddenly get a bunch of cattle and you're grazing your cattle in woods. That's going to be a decertification. You sign a conservation easement with an organization that doesn't allow for timber harvesting on your property. It's going to be a management restriction. You're not allowed to harvest your timber anymore. It's not going to qualify anymore. You can sign conservation easements that allow you to manage your timber, but you just got to be cautious with them. And if you're looking at doing that, I would urge you to work with your service forester before you sign anything to make sure you're not going to run into those issues. So conversion to a land use other than forest land. In Eastern Ohio, with this oil and gas boom we've got going on over here, there's a lot of well pads going in, a lot of pipelines going in. And like I said earlier, if that pipeline's wider than 120 feet, it's going to take that ground out of certification. So landowner may be able to keep the property in the program if they still have a minimum of 10 acres, but in other cases, they may not be able to. And again, work with your service forester ahead of time. So, some benefits beyond taxes. You know, all we've really talked about through this whole seminar so far is you know what the requirements are of these programs to save you tax money, but really they bring in some other benefits as well. You know, with forest tax law especially, you're getting professional forestry advice. You know, foresters meeting with you, talking about your goals for the property. What do you want out of the property? And they're writing that plan to cater to that. So if you follow that advice and you follow your management plan while getting a significant tax break, you're also getting a healthier forest and a faster growing forest, or maybe a forest that produces more acorns for your wildlife, or whatever your goals may be. It's also going to help support you getting periodic income from your forest land, a renewable resource. Our forests are the most renewable resource we have. And, you know, if you're doing it right and following the recommendations of your forester, your forest is going to be more valuable. You're going to be able to harvest more frequently. So, also allows you the enjoyment of your forest that's going to better meet your goals, better wildlife habitat, and whatever other goals you have that you work into that forest land. You know, you're going to be in a better position to enjoy them. So, and managing your forest benefits all of us indirectly. It's that legacy of forest stewardship. It's higher quality forests, healthier forests. Healthier forests can fight off more insects and disease issues. And they're also a lot more aesthetically pleasing for you and your neighbors and everyone else driving by. So we're getting pretty close here to wrapping up. And one of the things I was thinking about is how do you determine which program is going to be better for you? And it's not something I can answer. And it's probably not something your forester can answer. And the really unknown there is how much is CAUV going to save you versus forest tax law. The CAUV is often a 60 to 90% tax savings, where forest tax law is always 50%. But a couple things I want you to think about. When trying to determine what your tax savings is, remember to calculate the value of your house out first. Your house, any buildings, improvements, oftentimes those are the biggest part of your tax bill. And I've had people, you know, come to me with big tax bills and small acres, especially. If you've got 11 acres with a home site, I don't think I said this, but in both programs, we take out an acre for the home site. So if you have 11 acres and a house on it, your 10 acres have to be fully forested to qualify. But I've had people, you know, come into this program with 11 acres and a house on it, and after it's all said and done, they've only saved anywhere from $50 to $100 a year, because the huge portion of their tax bill was going into their house to pay for the taxes on the house. But I have other people who, with larger acres or with no houses or with very high valued forest land, that save thousands of dollars. So, you know, it can be very beneficial to you, but it just be worth looking at your tax bill and seeing what you're going to save. Forest tax law is pretty easy. Take your wooded acres, figure out what you're paying on your wooded acres, cut it in half, and that's what your tax savings is going to be. But for CAUV, you're more than likely going to have to ask the county auditor to calculate that savings for you and tell you what it's going to be. And it's not simple for them to do either. They have to look at your soil types, the productivity of the soil, the land use that's on that soil type, and then they can set a value to it and they have to calculate all that up. So it's not something you can walk in and get an answer in 2 minutes and walk back out the door. But if you really want to know which program is going to be better for you, those are the steps you're going to want to go through. You generally, you know, with CAUV, they rarely have a forester inspecting. Some counties are working with their soil and water conservation districts, so they're using a natural resources expert to inspect the ground to make sure you're qualifying. But you don't have a forester with easy access to come out and help you manage your woods. With forest tax law, you've got both the forester that wrote your plan and your state service forester that can provide advice whenever you want and have help with that. So one thing here that might be useful for you is this map. So what this is showing is this is from 2018. So it's the newest one we have, but it is a little outdated. But it is showing the percent of market value for CAUV. So if we look at, say, Guernsey County, because that's where I'm from, so it stands out to me. It says 34. So it's 34% is the percent of market value of CAUV. So what that means is a landowner applying for CAUV or enrolled in CAUV is going to save 66% on their taxes on average in Guernsey County. So you got to flip that number around, subtract it from 100, however you want to do it. So in Guernsey County, in theory, CAUV is going to be a better tax savings than forest tax law, because CAUV is going to be 66%. Forest tax law is going to be 50%. But remember, it's based on your land use, based off your soil type, so it's going to vary. This is just an average. But if we look down at Washington County, it's at 51. You're going to save 49% under CAUV. You're going to save 50% under forest tax law. Meigs County at 64. Do the math backwards, you're what, 36% savings under CAUV versus 50. And then there's going to be some other counties with Delaware County's at 25. So it varies a good bit. I would just use this as a starting point to figure out which program you might want to go into. But, I would really want to have the auditor kind of calculate what your savings might be and talk with your forester, figure out which program might be best for you. So with that, like I said, I just kind of want to give you an overview today of both programs, give you a little more insight of what their requirements are and what they entail. And this is my contact information. If you've got a question about forest tax law, feel free to reach out to your service forester in your county. You can get to them at the website there at the bottom, or reach out to me anytime you want to. CAUV, most of our service foresters are pretty knowledgeable about CAUV in their county, but ultimately the rules and requirements are set through your county auditor. So that's where you're gonna want to send your questions to. So with that, Kathy, I think I've covered it.
Okay, so we do have a few questions. First one says, will greenhouse production of potted plants qualify for CAUV if acreage and sales income are met?
I believe so. I know vegetables would qualify, so tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. I would assume potted plants would, but you'd want to ask your county auditor that for sure. Again, we don't deal in the CAUV regularly, so I'm not exactly sure on that.
Yeah, I'm kind of where you are. I would think that would qualify, but it is worth checking with your county auditor because, as Jeremy said, they all have a little bit different interpretations of the rules and laws. So check in with the county auditor. The next one, can a landowner be enrolled in CAUV and OFTL at the same time?
They can, but not on the same acreage. So you could have a parcel with farm ground under CAUV and the woods under forest tax law, but your same acreage can't be in both programs.
Okay. Then Robert has more of a comment. He says CAUV value is based on the agricultural production value. Therefore, typically the poorer the soil, the higher the reduction. And then he says for CAUV forestry side, there's an additional $750 an acre clearing cost reduction, as well as the potential of a $750 per acre reduction if the soil type would need to have tile drainage installed in order to be farmed.
Just another reason to have your county auditor calculate your tax savings before you apply.
Okay, so Dorothy asks, I have a wooded area of 10 plus acres with cycromonious fireflies gather and light up the woods for several weeks in June and July. Does this qualify for protection under CAUV?
That's a good question. I've never had a question about fireflies, but wildlife management does not qualify for CAUV. So you get a lot of landowners who purely buy their property to hunt. So, you know, they're talking about deer or, you know, squirrels or rabbits or whatever, and that does not qualify for CAUV because it's not an agricultural production, not a timber production. So I would say probably not.
She does have 10 plus acres. It's just that the firefly side doesn't help it
Right.
in its qualifications, right?
If you're producing hay or doing some grazing or producing some kind of a crop on that 10 acres or forest land, you're, managing the forest, it could, but just for the fireflies alone, it would not.
Okay, so what I'm gonna do is we're gonna stop recording on Marnie's end.